Everybody, once again to these talks. And this talk is going to be a little bit different from some of the other ones that I have given, as you'll see. And this is part one of two talks on this subject. And just to let you know that when I was putting this together, it was a culmination of things that I had read and learned over many, many years. And when I started putting together, I had a lot of trouble trying to choose which particular items I wanted to discuss. So I decided, well, instead of trying to fit it all in and shoehorn it into one talk, I decided that I would split it into two parts. And so the second one's going to be in 2 weeks. And Cora is my techie here. She's been my aide through all this, so I appreciate that very much. And Cora, they're going to be able to register for the other one on the same website, is that right? On the same?
Yeah, it's actually the same link. So if you've already registered and you're here now, you can use the exact same link to get in next time.
So that'll be in 2 weeks, not next week. So just to put this in context, some of you have heard some of the earlier talks in this series. This is the series that I put together for our synagogue, Beth David B'nai Israel Beth Am here in Toronto, and now which we're offering to a wider audience. And the first 4 of these talks, this is a series on Science Meets the Bible. The first 4 talks I've given over the last number of weeks. And if you weren't able to attend them, you can actually see them. Cora has posted all of these on the website for Beth David B'nai Israel Beth Am on YouTube. So if you go to YouTube and put in Beth David B'nai Israel Beth Am, you'll come to the website, and the first item is it says 78 or 80 videos. And if you click that, you will find the Patriarch, Matriarch, and Akedah talks right near the top. The other 2 are on there as well, but they were given in June, July, so you'll have to go down quite a few rows, but you will find them if you'd like. Today, we're going to be dealing with a couple of talks that I've not given before. Talk number 5, the Holy Temple and Ark. Again, I give Cora the credit. It was a stroke of brilliance that she had, because she slotted it for December 14th. So that will be in 4 weeks from now. I gave that once on a Friday morning because it was talk that I give to the students in the archaeology class, Rachel Urowitz's class at Chat each year. And I gave that in the spring, but it was during a Friday morning. So she thought it would be nice to do this on December 14th. And we looked at the calendar, and wouldn't you know, she put it right in the middle of Chanukkah. So where is there a better time in the year to talk about the Temple Mount, the archaeology, the history there, than on the holiday when it was actually rededicated in our history by the Maccabees. So a brilliant stroke of genius there. So we're going to do that on December 14th. And the Kabbalah geometry I've given a couple of times, but I'll give it one final time for this year, 5781. And that one will probably be early in the new year. So Cora will slot it, and then we'll let you know. So today is Hidden Meanings in Biblical Hebrew. And I just put this up each time we go through our journey into these various aspects of history and archaeology and Jewish history, Tanakh. As I mentioned before, to be able to relate the background to these different events and sites, you really have to have a little background in a number of different sciences, which I've listed here. And we've had to draw on a few of these in each of the talks that I've given so far, and we will have to draw on a few of these in the talk I'm giving now. The only difference is that in this talk, we're going to have to do a little bit of mathematics and a little bit of statistics, but I don't want you to turn off and leave the meeting right away. If you can give me a little breather here, we will be able to get through this without too much deep math, but there are some little background things I'll have to give you later on. So here are the topics for today. We're going to talk about the Hebrew letters in the hexagram or Star of David. Gematria. Gematria is numerology. It's the subdivision of Kabbalah, actually, and from the ancient mystical philosophy of Judaism, with the science of numerology and how numbers relate to how we understand the text and how we understand various values. Lots of examples of that. Then we're going to talk about the meanings of the first two letters of the Aleph Beit, and part one of some interesting words. And those are ones that I think you'll find quite interesting. We're also then going to talk about the calculation of pi. It's not an apple pie, it's actually the symbol pi, which is a mathematical symbol. We're going to talk about that. And then a little bit at the end, science meets the Bible directly with some hidden relationships. And I'm going to show you one of the sources that I have, which you can order on for your interest. And it's this book called Coincidences in the Bible and in Biblical Hebrew. And it's by a professor of engineering at the Ben Gurion University in the Negev by the name of Chaim Shor. And I'll be talking about him a little bit later, because some of what I'm going to talk about, especially in the last section, is the science of some things that are going to send shivers down your back when you see what he's come up with. So these are the 6 topics for today. And these are my sources for today's talk. So it's Chaim Shor's Coincidences in the Bible. I'm also going to be drawing on a series that was given by Rabbi Michael Skrobak last year at Sher Shemayim. He is one of the directors of Jews for Judaism, and he gave a talk on the mystical meanings of the Hebrew alphabet. And I'll be drawing on some of what he talked about, which overlaps my work as well. Also the Zohar, which is the Bible, quote unquote, of Kabbalah, which I'll be referring to. The Midrash Rabbah, which is the commentary by the Midrashim, this one specifically on Beraishit. A book by Professor Kushner called The Book of Letters, a Mystical Aleph Beit. And of course the Tanakh, which is our original Hebrew. This is part 2, just so you know, to whet your appetite for 2 weeks from now. We're going to talk about some of the parts of the body. Part 2 of interesting words, some interesting names. Again, part 2 of Science Meets the Bible here with some hidden relationships. And then the pièce de résistance, the grand finale, small and large letters in the Tanakh. And some of that is going to really give you some shivers down your back as well. So we're opening now into a treasure chest of work in the Tanakh, and I've shown this to you, I think, before. And if you don't know what this is, you can see the ibis and the various carvings there. This is the unbroken seal on King Tutankhamun's tomb in 1923, just as Howard Carter was ready to open it to find the tomb. And I'm going to mention one thing right now, and that is that I said in my various talks that you really can't understand a lot of the nuances of the Bible without knowing the biblical Hebrew itself. And we're going to go even multiple layers, not just into the text itself, but into the letters and how the letters are built, how the letters are arranged. And you're going to see just how many layers and various variations of things that are there to be discovered and that are there for us to enjoy and for us to learn about, that have meaning for us in the actual Torah and the Tanakh. So I've shown you this. This is the Kabbalistic view of creation, which starts with day 1 with light, and then the separation of the firmament, and then day 3 with birds and fish and water, and then the great light above, and then the land on each side and living things. And this creates the Kabbalistic view of creation is called the hexagram. Now it's called the Star of David in modern Hebrew, but it was not the original symbol of Judaism. We discussed that actually in a previous talk. The original symbol of Judaism, of course, was the menorah, as we saw from ossuaries in the time of the Second Temple period. But the hexagram is a mystical symbol that is also seen in a number of other religions and contexts, both religious and pagan. It's actually on Hindu temples. It's actually in Muslim tombs. And it is also was found at the center of Stonehenge many, many years ago. So it's not just a unique Jewish symbol, but it has become in modern times a symbol of Judaism. And it's on the Israeli flag, of course. And a shout out to my brother-in-law, Stan, who sent this to me many, many months ago. But this is the hexagram, actually contains all of the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So there is Zayin through Tet, Aleph through Tet, and then through to Tzadi, and then through from Kuf through to the final letters. So within the Star of David, within this hexagram, you can actually find pieces that make up the various letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And as we get into the actual nuances of these letters and words, here's a picture I showed at my last talk. This is one of the last pictures, the photos of Leo Tolstoy telling a story to his grandchildren in 1909. Those of you that haven't been with me in previous talks, I like to include little historic vignettes. And just to let you know that all the pictures I've shown in these and previous talks, as a disclaimer, they're all available through Wikipedia or Wikipedia Commons, so they are on common websites. So now let's go into Gematria, the science of numerology and various examples. So numerology comes from the assigning of numbers, values to the various Hebrew letters, something that many of you, I think, are familiar with. And this, again, comes from Kabbalah, and it's listed here as to what the numbers are assigned to these letters. So from Aleph, number 1 through the 10th letter, are consecutive numbers 1 through 10. But then when you get to Kaf, the next letter, and then further along up to Tzadi, they are each 10 units separated. So we go up to Tzadi with number 90, and then Kuf is 100, and the last 4 letters are all 100 units, which means that if you're going to go beyond 400, you have to actually combine letters in order to create the number of that equivalent. So we can start off with a very simple question. What is the current Hebrew year, if we're going to use these letters to designate the number? The Hebrew year is 5781. And how would you make the Hebrew equivalent, just to show you how this system works? Well, if you have 5781, it's composed of 5,000 plus 700 plus 80 plus 1. And how are we going to get that many numbers from this limited number of letters? Well, we're going to leave 500 for a moment and just talk about 700 first of all. We have to combine letters to get 700. The 300 and 400, you could see from Tuf and Sheen. The 80 is actually directly there with the pay. And 1 is, of course, Aleph. So that is the designation of the year. 5781 is the Hebrew year, Tuf, Sheen, Pei, Aleph. But not quite. We don't have the 5,000 yet. So how do we get 5,000? They fudge it by taking the numerical equivalent, the first number 5, and putting a little asterisk, a little asterisk after the letter. So this is actually the name of the Hebrew year, Hey, Tuf, Sheen, Pei, Aleph. However, there are some mystics who don't use this notation. They actually designate the millennium that the year is in. The millennium is actually the 6th millennium. And so there are some circles where they use the letter Vav, which means 6th millennium, Tuf, Sheen, Pei, Aleph. And the using of this alternative designation is something that we're going to be using at the next talk at the very end of the last section. So if you want to take Gematria to its simplest form, I think some of you might recognize this gentleman. Unfortunately, we lost him very recently. That, of course, is Sir Sean Connery. Sean Connery died just recently, October 31st, 2020. And I shout out to my sister Carol, who I think is on now on this Zoom. She sent this to me just recently. If you take the numbers in the date of his passing, 311020, Dun, 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 dun. You come up with 007. So that's the simplest, one of the simplest applications that you will see of Gematria. So let's start off with something a little more on the Jewish side. So on Purim, we celebrate a directive from the sages that says that you should drink until you cannot distinguish between the goodness of Mordechai and the evil of Haman, which means that they should be fairly equivalent. How do we say the goodness of Mordechai? We bless him, Baruch Mordechai, Ha-Yehudi, Baruch Mordechai. If you add up the numerical equivalents, I'm going to save you a little time so you don't have to do it yourselves from scratch, you come up with 502. And if the rabbis, the sages, says you have to match the goodness of Mordechai to the evil of Haman, it turns out that the numerical equivalent as Arur Haman is also 502. It brings me to one other point that the sages make, and those that are the mystics of Kabbalah, that if a word or a letter or a phrase has the same numerical equivalent as another word or phrase, so if it's a word that has another matching word of the same value, a phrase with the same matching value, there's some relation between the two, and there should be a link that you should find between the two. So we're going to see examples of that, but this is one example of the numerical equivalence of our directive on Purim. Now we're going to actually talk about the Zohar. I'm going to tell you a story that shows you how these letters and numbers and concepts are all related to each other. So remember that Adam was given the right to name the species of animals and plants at creation. Prior to that, prior to the sin of eating from the tree of knowledge, the serpent who deceived Eve and then Adam was known by God. He gave it the name Chet, the same as the letter Chet. Since Adam was given the authority, it's in Genesis chapter 2, verse 20, to give names to the living things as he saw fit. So when the serpent was evil, Adam decided that it needed to be controlled by two godly letters. So what he did, he took the Nun from Adonai and the Shin from Shaddai and named the serpent Nachash, which is the word that's used in Beraishit in the Bible. So Adam, with his authority, changed the name from Chet, which God gave it, to Nachash. And then there was also what we call the contrary angel. You talk about the contrary angels that are in the Midrash, and there are various names for these contrary angels. One is Satan, Satan, but the name that God gave it was Samech Mem, Sam. To counteract its evil powers, Adam added the divine letters of El to create the name Samael. And these two were now under control of divine intervention, and 9 generations passed with no incidents after the Garden of Eden, thanks to Adam's intervention with these divine names, until the 10th generation of Noach, and the Bible says that the land was filled with depravity and sinfulness called Chamas, Chet Mem Samech. And that allowed the evil angels and serpent to regain their initial powers because Chamas is composed of the Chet and Sam. And so they were stripped of the divine intervention and could now wreak havoc, and God had to deal with that. So what did he do? To reduce the powers of these two beings, he told Noach to build an ark of specific dimensions. What are the dimensions? Its length, 300 cubits. 300 is Shin. Its width was 50 cubits. That is directly from the Nun. It had to have a height of 30 cubits. 30 is Lamed. And finally, the slope of the roof had to be exactly 1 cubit, and that's Aleph. So now we have these 4 new letters created by the design and construction of the ark. So how do we reduce the powers of this Hamas in this 10th generation? Well, Hamas is Chet and Mem. The Chet is linked now to the Shin and Nun. The Mas is now linked to the Aleph and Lamed. And so by creating the ark, Noah recreated Nachash, and the Mem Samech from 30 and 1 cubits recreated Samael. And so from the design of the ark, we got the restoring of the names back to divine control and allowed Noah and his family to be saved from the flood that destroyed the evil generation. Tale from the Zohar. Now from the creation story, we go on to Maase Beraishit. And in the early chapter, chapter 1, we got two names that come up. One is the name in the second verse, B'choshech al pnei tehom. Tehom is the name of Tiamat, which was the Babylonian goddess of the seas, associated with the original primordial sea before order was imposed. And but there are midrashim that talk about the fact that the Tehom was introduced to show that there was actually a god supreme to any of the gods that were mentioned in the pantheon at the time of creation. And then it says later, Vayivra Elohim et hataninim. It's the only species specifically named. And taninim, also according to Kabbalah and according to midrashim, is the same as Leviathan or Leviathan, which was a dragon god from Canaanite myths and represented forces of evil within the world. Now, in the Sfirot of Kabbalah, and I've shown you this from the Kabbalah lecture, and again, that will come in January again, but these are the 11 Sfirot of what are called the Kabbalistic Tree of Life. The support for this entire endeavor is the one at the bottom called Malchut. Now, within this diagram, you can see that in addition to all of these nodes, these Sfirot, there are all these linking lines that join the geometric figure. And this is a whole study on its own. It takes people years to explain all of this, but within these paths, in a specific array, are all the 22 Hebrew letters. So there are 22 paths, each with a designated Hebrew letter. So Kabbalah takes these letters and assigns mystical properties to all of them and actually incorporates them into this whole Sfirat diagram with meanings that go well beyond what we're going to talk about today. But what I want to talk about is the Sphira at the bottom, the one that supports the entire world, so to speak, of these Sfirot called Malchut. So going back to the meaning of Leviathan as a giant sea monster, the Kabbalists use a different term for what they call Leviathan. The Leviathan is also known as the world. It's another word, it's a code word for the world. And the Sphira of Malchut is the kingdom that supports the entire world. So those are the Hebrew words Leviathan and Malchut. Now Malchut has a Sphira. If you add up the numbers, the equivalents of the Mem, Lamed, Chaf, Vav, and Taf, you come up with 496. That is supporting the world represented by Leviathan, which is also numerically 496. And again, the Kabbalists say that if you have two words that have the same numerical equivalent, there has to be a relation between the two. 496 is a perfect number. So you mathematicians out there, a perfect number is a number equal to the sum of all its divisors, such as number 6 is the first perfect number. Its divisors are 1, 2, and 3, and if you add that up, you get number 6. The next perfect number, I think, is 178 or something like that, but the third perfect number is 496. It's all these numbers added up, which are the divisors of 496, and when you add up all these divisors, you come up with the 496. So if it's a perfect number, what the Kabbalists now say is that even though Malchut supports a perfect world and Leviathan represents another word for world, It's actually up to us to make that world perfect. And that is by fulfilling his requirements, fulfilling his laws. And we bring ourselves through these various sfirot, these various attributes, we bring ourselves up to as close to the divine presence as we can. So God didn't actually make the world perfect, but we're required to repair the parts that he left unfinished or imperfect to bring it to perfection, with 496 representing a perfect number. Now we're moving on to another aspect. What about the meaning of the Chanukkah Driedl? Outside of Israel, the Driedl has 4 Hebrew letters on its side, representing Nes, Gadol, Haya, Sham. The Nun is 50. Gadol is 3, the Gimel. The Hey is 5. And the Shin is 300. If you add up the 4 letters, it's 358. Nes Gadol Haya Sham. Now, we said that in the earliest history of mankind, we come back to this Nachash again, with first evil being was the serpent, Nachash. It turns out that the final redemption in the end of days that will eradicate evil, like we see represented by the Nachash, is the Mashiach. Mashiach, Mem, Shin, Yud, Chet. And Chanukkah, which is this holiday, when we do this rededication, where these symbols come in, these 4 letters, is our rededication of the temple and rededication of our service to Hashem. And there are the 4 letters, added together is 358. The evil at the beginning, the serpent, Nachash, is 358. The final redemption by Mashiach is 358. And the meaning then is that this evil seen from the beginning of time, represented by the Nachash, can be met and mitigated by equal forces of good, by rededication and service to God, same number, to bring us the final redemption, exactly the same number, all related to one another. Next section coming up. So anybody know who this is? This is Mark Twain at age 15 years. Now let's go to the meaning of the first 2 letters. Here's a story from the Midrash Rabbah, which is one of the commentaries on Beraishit, that when God commenced the Torah, he began with the word Beraishit. Beraishit, bara Hashem, da 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 da. So Beraishit starts with the letter Beit. And that presents a problem because somebody started to complain. That was the letter Aleph, complained to God because it was the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet and argued, I should be the first letter of the Torah. For 26 generations, according to the Midrash, Aleph complained, why was I left out at the start of the Torah? So where did God compromise? He made a promise to Aleph that when he gave the Torah, the definitive code of laws to his people, he would then start the 10 Commandments with the Aleph. And there is the Aleph now, Anochi Hashem Elohecha, now starts the first commandment. And Aleph was now happy forever. So this is from the Midrash Rabbah, but Aleph has a lot of other things to talk about. So it was happy forever. It's a silent letter, as you know. Whenever you see an Aleph, we don't actually pronounce it. So it's meant to represent humility. This is all, again, from various talks. And I can, again, give a little credit here to Rabbi Skobach, who discussed some of this in his talks last year. Aleph represents the number 1, which is the oneness or singleness of God. So Aleph has a relationship to Hashem. And it's going to be even deeper when we come in another couple of slides. There's Aleph in the pantheon here. Now we want to ask, when is the first time in the Torah when Aleph appears at the start of a word? So Hashem didn't just compromise and gave Aleph the first letter of the Aser Dibrot, the 10 Commandments, he actually gave it another honor. The first time Aleph appears at the beginning of a word is in the name Elohim. When it says, Vayomer Elohim Yehi Or, Aleph got to be the first letter of the first name of God, symbolizing the sacred connection of that letter as representing Hashem. Another thing that people do, another aspect of Hebrew hidden meanings and words, again, you have to know the actual Hebrew letters here, because the letter Aleph, each of the Hebrew letters has a word that is the pronunciation of that letter. So the name of the letter is Aleph, Aleph Lamed Fe Sofit. And if you take its letters as without the Sofit, but Aleph Lamed Pe, here's another association of Aleph with God. You take those 3 letters, add them up, and it turns out to be 111. And from mystical properties, this is 3 unities, 3 ones. And it's meant to mean the singleness of God being singular, God, the God of justice, and the God of mercy. The 3 attributes, the singularity, the attributes of justice, and the attributes of mercy, which are all prevalent through the Torah. It's also meant as a stylistic approximation of the sheen. The sheen is 3 strokes vertically connected, and those 3 are meant to be a sacred letter, the first letter of the name Shaddai, which is the name that is used for God in certain parts of the Torah. So this the triple ones is also an attribute of God. The construction of the letter, this is something we could talk about the construction and the meaning of every single of the 22 letters as a lecture on its own. But let's just talk about one letter. The construction of the Aleph is actually in 3 pieces. And if you want to look at a scribe who's actually writing a Torah scroll, even though there's 22 letters plus the Sofits, you'll notice that they don't need more than, I think it's 5 or 6 different strokes to create all of the letters, because they can be created by pieces that are part of other letters. So let me just show you. If you have the Aleph, it's composed of 2 yuds and a vav. That's how a scribe will draw it. He'll draw it in the Torah with 2 yuds and a vav. And there's the 2 yuds, there is the vav. When you add those together, you come up with 26. What is 26 as well? It's actually the sum of the Yud K Vav K, which is the sacred name of God, the Tetragrammaton as it's called. So the link of Aleph is not just in its singularity, in its unity, in its number, numerical, in the word Aleph, but also in how it's constructed is linked to Hashem. And finally, Aleph begins many sacred and other names. Many names in the Bible start with the letter Aleph. It's given a sacred place, not only at the beginning of the 10 Commandments, but it's also the beginning of the name of the first human being, Adam. It's Avraham's first letter, Eliyahu, the names Adonai and Elohim, and the number 1 itself is Achad, starting with an Aleph. So Aleph has a lot to be happy about. A brief word about the other letter, Beit. Like I said, you could go on each of these letters. What about Beit? What does it symbolize? It's actually the first letter of the Torah, as we mentioned, Beraishit bara Elohim. Now, Hebrew letters, of course, are read from right to left, and Beit is directed open to the left, which means that it's hiding over here. It's hiding something here. It's open this way towards the other letters, but it's blocked going that way. And mystically, it's given the credit that one cannot know what existed before creation. The Rabbanim and Pirkei Avot and various other sources describe what was actually created before the world was created. But as far as the Torah itself, the Torah gives you no clues beyond what's the Beit. Before that is not given. And what does it symbolize? It's actually Beit is the name of the letter, but Beit is also a start for the sacred names for the houses of God. The Beit HaMikdash, or the Holy Temple, a Beit Midrash, which is a house of study, and Beit Knesset, which is a synagogue. Each of these has the word Beit, which means house of, but it happens also to be the name of the letter. The last thing about Beit is that I made one slip there at the previous slide. If you noticed, those of you who read the Torah, that the Beit is not the same size as the other letters, it's actually enlarged. So the Beit at the beginning, on the first column, the first word of a Torah, the Beit is purposely enlarged to emphasize its place in the Torah and to emphasize that we cannot know what comes before. We're only given information about what goes beyond. And it's one of the many letters in the Tanakh that is either enlarged or minified. And we're going to talk about that when we get to the grand finale in talk number 2 in 2 weeks. A really amazing story that involves the minification and enlargement of letters. Okay, getting to a new section. I think a lot of you will know who is on the right here. This is one of the earliest photographs in history, and it's of a young man on the right, whom we all will recognize as Abraham Lincoln, but the man on the left may be less familiar to you. But in the early 1840s and 50s, there was a very famous photography studio of a photographer pioneer by the name of Matthew Brady. And this is Edgar Allan Poe with Abraham Lincoln in Matthew Brady's studio in Washington in 1849, one of the earliest photographs we have of Abraham Lincoln. Now we'll get to some interesting words. Okay, this is part 1. There are actually some interesting words that I have for you in part 2 of this. But let's start with the first and last letters of the Torah. So here's Genesis 1, chapter 1. It starts again, Beraishit bara Elohim. And it ends at the end of Devarim, the end of Deuteronomy, with the words Le'enei Kol Yisrael. Beit and Lamed, the first letter and the last letter of the Torah. On Simchas Torah, we go through a ritual every year where we read the end of the Torah, V'zot HaBracha, the very last parsha, and then we return to start the Torah again. And then we go through the whole year reading all the parshas, come back, Simchas Torah, we finish with V'zot HaBracha, and return to commence the Torah again. V'zot HaBracha and Beraishit, and V'zot HaBracha ends, Le'enei Kol Yisrael. Beraishit begins, Beraishit bara Elohim. So when we finish the Torah and come back to Beraishit, we're not going Beit Lamed, we're actually going Lamed to Beit. So we're finishing the Torah with Le'enei Kol Yisrael and commencing the Torah with Beraishit bara Elohim. So the Lamed and the Beit are actually linked in this order. Lamed, Beit, not Beit Lamed. It's in the order of Lamed at the end. We then commence the Torah and start with a Beit. Now, what does the combination of Lamed and Beit mean? It's heart, circulation. So Lev is the continuous circulation of blood in the human body, which is our life and physical being. And on Simchas Torah, we then finish the Bible and finish the Torah and begin the Torah again, a spiritual cycle, the annual cycle of circulation of Torah reading, Torah learning, and service to Hashem in the annual cycles, the same as the circulation as we have in our body, the Lev. Lev has a numerical value of 32, and this love of learning, this love and service to God is reflected in 2 other words, and I mentioned that the Kabbalists look at words of equivalent numerical value to be ones that have equal value. Kavod honor, and divine glory also has 32 as its numerical equivalent. And Yachid, meaning singular, again, this concept of God being singular, a singular God, Echad, Hashem Echad, Yachid is also 32. So the lave, the love, the circulation, same as Kavod, same as Yachid, linked to the unity of Hashem. Now I'm going to show you something else about an interesting word, that sometimes the words have geometric meanings. Let's look at the word mayim, the word for water. I'm going to change the last sofit to the actual letter mem. And some of you, the chemists out there, are going to probably know where I'm heading with this. The usual grammatical form is mayim. Mayim is a plural word, even though it's a singular kind of chemical concept, like the word for face. The word for face is not a singular word, it's panim, it's a plural form. Whenever you see a Hebrew word in the Bible that has a plural form, it implies either duplication or symmetry. So the word mayim has a symmetry about it, but more than that, it has another property. What is the chemical structure for water? It's H2O. Symmetry on two sides with central symmetry, exactly like its Hebrew equivalent. So there are words in the Bible that actually have geometric properties. This is the most characteristic one, that mayim itself has the symmetry similar to its exact chemical structure. Another one that's quite interesting, in only one place in the entire Bible, the Tanakh, do we have the word in Hebrew, the biblical Hebrew word for pregnancy. There's the word hara, which means to give birth, and that's in several places in Beraishit and in other places throughout the Tanakh, but the actual word for pregnancy appears only once in the book of Hosea, in Hosea in chapter 9. The Hebrew word is herayon. Now, let's get another thinking cap on. We're going to get the mathematical numerical value of herayon. Is 5, 200, 10, 650 is 271. Can you think of where that is significant? What is the average number of days of a human pregnancy? 271. So the Hebrew equivalent of the word exactly reflects the obstetric implication of the word itself. Exact numerical equivalent. Okay, now we're going on to another series of concepts. Well, here is the construction of the Statue of Liberty in 1884. Now the calculation of pi. You're going to find this really interesting. When I read about this, I was really blown away, but I'm going to go through it in stages here for you. Calculation of pi, we're not talking about an apple pie or a cherry pie. We're talking about this guy. That's something you learned in high school. Pi is what's called an irrational number, which can't be expressed as a fraction. And it's defined, if you want to go back, this is back to high school, the ratio of the circumference of a circle to its diameter. Circumference to diameter is pi. Its calculation, if you go, it's now was a kind of a contest among computers in the 60s, 70s, and 80s as to which computer could calculate the value of pi to the most decimal places as fast as possible and get it right. The number never repeats. It's an irrational number, and these numbers never repeat in any kind of sequence. For instance, if you have 1 out of 3, 1/3 is also an indefinite number, but it is 0.33333. It repeats. Pi is one of these numbers that is irrational and never repeats. So unless you have a computer, you'll never be able to figure out by any logistics what the number will be going beyond. But if we want to talk about the first 5 decimal places here, So like I said, this goes on, and there's computers now that can calculate within 5 seconds billions of places. So that's all contests among computer geeks. But if you want to know the actual value, you can actually look at a pi. So here's a pi, 3.1415926. So you can actually design it on your own pi and keep going in a spiral if you want. Or you can be a mathematician and figure out exactly what the number is. So where is the earliest known calculation? The earliest known written down goes to Archimedes 2,200 years ago. And he calculated as 3.14, which is a number we use in our physics exams and mathematics exams. You know, it's the one that's kind of easy, 3.14. Fibonacci, who's the same mathematician who described what's called the Fibonacci sequence, which is also in fractal mathematics, if you're into that, where the Fibonacci sequence is 1 + 1 + 2 + 5, you know, where you add consecutive numbers and it comes into this sequence. He also calculated pi back in the 12th century, 3.142. The first time it got to 5 decimal places was a lesser known mathematician in the 16th century by the name of Othel, and he calculated it to 3.14159. So that's thought to be the first time that it was calculated to that accuracy. And the question is, were these the earliest accurate values for pi? Well, if you calculate it at this significance, there's a reference in the Bible, in the first book of Kings, chapter 7. It's the only place, there's only 2 places in the Bible where a circumference and diameter are actually listed. This is the first reference. The other reference is in Chronicles describing the same event. It has to do with the construction of the items around the temple. And it says here that he made a molten sea 10 cubits from one brim to the other. So one brim to the other is the diameter of this circular structure. And it was round, and the line of 30 cubits did circle around, which is the circumference. So this goes back at least to 6th to 7th century BCE. And what did it actually say? It said in Kings number 1 that the cubits of the diameter is 30, the circumference is 30, and the circumference is 30 cubits, the diameter is 10 cubits, and pi is the ratio of the circumference to the diameter is 3.0. So the Bible in Kings gives you a pretty, it's a nice round number, 3.0 for this pi, okay? You're going to calculate pi from the Bible. Not so fast, not so fast. True value is 3.14159. Okay, didn't happen until the 16th century, except for one quirk here. It says from one brim to the other and one line around it. Here's where you have to know the words in the Bible. You have to actually know what's in the passage. It says the diameter, misfato ad sfato, but the circumference has a word, agal kav. Kav is a line of circle. It's the circumference. Now I said kav. The word is kuf vav hey in the Bible. You can look it up. It doesn't say kuf vav, which is the actual word. The word should be kuf vav, kav. For some reason, whoever wrote this book, the biblical writer, put in a hey at the end, which is silent. So the word for kav, for line, is kav. What is this hey doing there? It's silent. Most people would look at it and say, well, it was just an error or a scribal error, that the hey really has no reason for being there. So that should have had the word kav, not kuf vav hey. Well, in the 18th century, one of the great sages in human history, the Gaon of Vilna, said that this extra hey is not an error at all. It's meant to be there. Because even though we say that the circumference to diameter, this pi, is 30 to 10, right? That's what we think. But if the hay is there, it's meant to change its numerical value. The hay is there not to be silent, not to be a misprint. It's meant to give you the value of the circumference that is correct. And if you take that ratio and alter the circumference by the factor, including this hay, the circumference is not 106, it's actually 111. And if you multiply this correction factor, including the hay, it's 3.14159. So the Gaon of Vilna figured out that the hay included in this calculation actually defines the accurate value of pi to 5 decimal places. This is recorded in the Bible 7th century BCE, many, many centuries before Otho actually calculated it, supposedly in the Middle Ages. So the true value in 1573 CE has this as Otho's calculation, but in the 7th century, if you use the correction factor from that silent hay, you come up with the true value of pi, centuries before we thought it was first discovered. I've shown you this picture before. This is the first computer in 1947, filled up an entire large room. This is ENIAC in Philadelphia. And my colleague, Steve Rubin, who's on our webinar today, mentioned that when he was an undergrad in Philadelphia, he drove by the building where this was housed. So we have a connection through one of my colleagues to this room. And Steve can calculate much quicker than that computer can ever calculate, I can tell you. Okay, we're finishing now with the last section of part 1. And these are hidden relationships. And I again give reference to Chaim Shor in this book, if you didn't see it before, Coincidences in the Bible and in Biblical Hebrew. And I give a shout out to him. I'm going to be working with everything that he describes. So we're going to talk about a few relationships today. And when we get into this, I have to give you some definitions. First of all, some statistics, and I apologize, we're not going to be too deep into this, but I have to give you some preliminary information so that you understand what I'm going to be discussing. There's 2 statistical facts you have to know. First of all, that relationships between variables, you remember from high school, you have X and Y, you plot on a graph in linear algebra. They can be linear scales or what are called logarithmic scales. So when you have something along the x-axis, a variable on the x-axis, a linear plot will simply be that the other variable is numerically in order, and then you get some relationship and find an equation to describe that. That's a linear plot. But in science, and you'll see that we're talking here about science meeting the Bible, sometimes science and in nature, the relationships are not linear, but they're based on logarithms. And logarithms are to the base 10 or other bases, or a linear, what are called the ln or natural logarithms. And when you get these in a logarithmic plot, they are actually plotted against numbers that are in multiples, like this. So rather than 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, they are actually in order of multiples. Here, 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. And when you plot them, if you take the logarithm, they then become linear because you're taking the logarithm of those multiples and it becomes a linear plot. But the relationship is what we call logarithmic. The other thing is that you have to know what's called regression. Regression is how strong is the relationship between these 2 variables. And for you scientists, it's called an R-squared. And it's correlated in science, in statistical analysis. The relationship can be very poor or very good. If you have a correlation R-squared between 0.6 and 0.8 out of a scale of 1.0, it's considered very good. If it's higher than that, it's very strong and almost irrefutable. And in science, it's very, very rare in scientific studies to have correlations over 0.9. 0.9 is very, very, very high. So you can have logarithmic or linear plots that get increases in the relationship, which we call positive, or it can be related in an inverse, which we call negative. And the positive correlation I'm going to show you all use the numerical values. So the x-axis for all of these analyses is going to be from the Gematria, the numerical value of these items, whether it's positive, and on the left will be the units we're going to use. And if it's a negative correlation, the numerical value is on the bottom and the units on the left. So you're going to see these graphs and how they're related. So let's actually apply them. So again, we're not going to go into the deep statistics, just to give you an idea of what Chaim Shor did in his spare time. So day, month, and year. In the Bible, these words are Yom, Yerach, and Shana. Yerach is an alternative name for Chodesh. Chodesh is not the actual biblical true word for month. Yerach is the actual word that he uses, and these are the Hebrew words. In this chart, you're going to see here the numerical values for each of these three items. And instead of the length of their day, they actually use a reciprocal called 1 over duration, which is the frequency is the actual unit. And if you take the log of the frequency, you get these numbers. And now let's plot them. The numerical values are here. The log of the frequency is here. And on a logarithmic plot, there's a day, the frequency of a day, the logarithmic of the frequency for month, and for a year. So you're taking the numerical values, plotting them against a scientific mathematical function, and you get a correlation of 0.997, which cannot be a coincidence. According to scientific principles, this is an irrefutable, complete correlation between the numerical value of these items and their frequency. What about ice, water, and steam? In the Bible, in ancient Hebrew, the words are kerach, mayim, and kitor. If you take their numerical values of these three items and plot them against their heat capacity at these temperatures, which are the usually accepted temperatures that they're recorded at, this is the unit. The unit is called heat capacity, also called specific gravity. If you remember from high school chemistry, these are the units. But the thing I want you to get out of this is, first of all, plotting their numerical values against the heat capacity for a linear plot. We don't have to use logarithms for this. Steam, ice, water, their numerical values are exactly correlated to the heat capacity. Coincidence? Not according to scientific analysis, that the words actually have a scientific correlation that is extremely, extremely strong. What about moon, earth, and sun? The word moon is yareach. Earth is eretz, sun is shemesh. The Hebrew word shemesh, eretz, yareach. We're going to now plot their numerical values against the log of their diameters in kilometers. These are the kilometers of their diameter. We're using a logarithmic plot this time. And once again, unbelievable. There's a correlation of the numerical values, the log of their diameter, in a logarithmic plot with the moon, the earth, and the sun in a perfect linear combination with a r-squared or regression correlation, unbelievably high, 0.99 whatever. And it's now, these three are all related to one another and their numerical values. There's more. How about the 7 planets? 7 planets: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, Pluto. Now, Chaim Shor extrapolates a bit to find the actual Hebrew names that are implied. These are the names that he uses for his analysis. Kochav for Pluto, Ash for Neptune, Teman, Shachar, Ksil, Mazar, and Kima. Kima is Mercury. And here we go. If you take their numerical values of all these planets and take the log of the diameter to give us the variable we're going to use, plotting their numerical values against the log of the diameter for a logarithmic plot for Pluto, Mercury, Mars, Venus, Neptune, Saturn, and Jupiter. Their Hebrew names and numerical values are in a perfect correlation, 0.9998, which is incredibly, incredibly strong. I'm going to dazzle you with one more, at least for this part. The last one is the colors of the spectrum. The spectrum is created by, you've seen them in rainbows. We also create it optically when you shine a light through a prism. It displaces them into their relative wavelengths. And you can look at the colors of the spectrum either from the wavelength of the visible light or the frequency of the light. They're both valid. This is the spectrum. In the Bible, in the Tanakh, there's 5 colors that are mentioned, the actual colors of which we know. These are the 5 that are in the Tanakh, and these are the words that are mentioned. Now you'll see the word for green is yerakon. It's not yarok, and I'll make the point again that the Hebrew words in the Bible are not exactly the same as what we have in modern Hebrew. Some of these words are actually unique to the Bible. So these are the words Adom, Tzahov, Yerakon, Techelet, and Argaman. But like I mentioned, you can separate them according to wavelength or frequency. So if we turn it around and go according to frequency, you reverse the order to this, and so you get the Hebrew in the other order. Adom, Tzahov, Yerakon, Techelet, Argaman, or like Hebrew would be the other way, Argaman, Techelet, Yerakon, Tzahov, Adom, going the other way. Here we are now with these 5 colors. The numerical values are here that we're going to use. Here are their wavelengths, but I mentioned that Chaim Shor found the correlation best with frequency. So we're taking the Hebrew numerical values of these words, the words in the Bible that you just know, that's what the words are, but here's their meaning now. Again, it's taken it to another level. Here's the frequency. This is a linear plot. We don't have to use logarithms. Red, yellow, magenta, green, and blue. Their correlation is 0.943. Incredibly, incredibly strong, which scientifically means that it cannot be a coincidence. So you can see that through these different words in the Bible, not only do the letters have meaning and the words, but the words have a scientific value that actually reflects their properties, which Chaim Shor fills his book with all these examples. Now, I'm going to finish with one other interesting quirk here. There is a word that nobody can translate. We don't know what the word means. In Yeshaya, Isaiah, chapter 44, there's a chapter that describes the construction of a building. And it says that the carpenter measures with a line and makes an outline with a word called sered. That's the word. Most translations translate it as a marker. But the Malbim, who was one of the great sages of the 19th century, and other commentators state that it is not a marker, it's actually a color, but we don't know what the color is. Chaim Shor figured out what color it was. If it is a color, where does sered lie within the frequencies or the wavelengths? Well, what Chaim Shor did was to take his paradigm, take the 3 letters, Sin, Resh, Daled, took its numerical value, and if his analysis is correct, we should be able to figure out what color this is. If you take sered, 504, and put it on this graph, it meets the line, the regression line, at a frequency of 598. That means that you can take this 598 hertz, the frequency, convert it back to a wavelength of 565. And now you know exactly where Sered is, based on its numerical value from the scientific analysis. So we've come to the end of part 1. This is, for those of you that have never seen this, you've seen the Great Wall of China extending over thousands of kilometers. This is where it actually ends, and that's where my talk now ends. So we started with the basics of the Hebrew letters from within the Magen David, within the hexagram, and we have ended with hidden relationships within the Bible. So I hope you've enjoyed this first journey. And when we go back, I'd like you to see that the science we used today include these: linguistics, archaeology, astronomy, astrophysics, geology, geometry, inorganic chemistry. We're going to be using that again. Kabbalah very heavily with its Gematria, linguistics, and math and statistics. I hope it wasn't too deep for you, but you had to know where he's coming from. The bottom line is that those relationships from a scientific value are irrefutable. They are not coincidences. Here's what you get next time in 2 weeks: parts of the body, other interesting words we'll discuss, various names that have interesting connotations, some more hidden relationships from Chaim Shor, and finishing with the pièce de résistance, the small and large letters in the Bible. So here we are at the end of today, and we reach the end of part 1.